I'm not from a rich family. I'm not from a private school. I'm just an ordinary kid who grew up in Kent, who went to a normal state school. I'll be honest, I much prefer these days where everything is so accessible. I think it's fantastic. 38 seconds, bang, every time, perfect. It was just unbelievable to witness someone so professional. He was excellent. Since COVID, we remote produce the production now. It gets you in the building, but it doesn't keep you in the building. So you've got to keep yourself in the building. Doesn't matter which country you're in, you'll be listening to the clips that I find interesting. So essentially, that's the job that I actually fulfill for Formula One. Fundamentally, if you forget the words team and radio, essentially we're storytellers. We're there to tell a story. So.
Hello and welcome to the Stripping the Dipping podcast. You're joined by your usual co-host, Denzel Clarkson, aka AMG Denz, and today, as always, we have another really fantastic episode. Now, if you've ever wanted to know, like, who's responsible for, those very interesting radio messages we get in the F1 broadcasts, and kind of the story behind that, also the insight behind those messages to the process of how that's broadcasted on the network, well, you're in luck because we've got a really awesome guest today. They've had experience as well as a director of sport and also a development producer too. So guys, I wish that you give our guest a really special warm welcome. It's the one and only, it's Ray Warner. Ray, how are you keeping?
Hello, yeah, I'm very well. Thank you very much. Yeah, nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you so much, Ray. It's obviously great to have your time today. And yeah, just like you've got a really interesting role. It's one that I guess, people obviously are aware of, but then also probably don't give as much attention and probably as much credit as they should. But before we get into that, Ray, tell us, we always kind of talk about this with all of our guests on the show. What were your earliest motorsport memories growing up?
So I'm based in England and was brought up here. So my earliest memories were watching a program called Grandstand. And on Grandstand, Formula One was part of their daily coverage or their weekend coverage, I should say. So, I'm talking, so I'm 50 now. So I was born in 1973. So my earliest memories were probably the sort of mid 90s. And I'm not and never have been an anorak about Formula One, but I've watched race after race. So going back to the Mansell, Prost, Senna days, I vaguely remember James Hunt racing, but yeah, and him and Niki Lauda obviously. But yeah, so basically from I would say the early 90s, the Damon Hill era, really. Hill, Schumacher, those sort of days, Montoya, Jack Villeneuve, those sort of guys. So yeah, I would say that's my earliest memories. But yeah, so I've worked for Formula One now for 12 years. So obviously since then I've a lot more knowledgeable than I was before I joined, I would say.
That's really exciting there, Ray. And, you're talking about like an era of Formula One that kind of goes back to the golden era, of course. That was a really sensational time, wasn't it? With Mansell Mania, the likes of Senna as well, which was just such a force in Formula One. And like you mentioned as well, even this Damon Hill, like he really managed to gather the hearts of the nation and just one of many successful, world champions we've had in the sport as well. So that's super cool. And of all of them, Ray, who would you say was like your favorite? Which driver of the ones you mentioned really stood out to you at the time?
I would say I was most engrossed by the Damon Hill-Michael Schumacher battle. And I've obviously traveling to circuits for a long time. I've sort of stood next to Damon in various queues at airports, etc. I've never actually bothered to introduce myself because I was a little bit in awe of him, I think, after watching him on TV for so long. Same with Michael Schumacher as well. When I was a student, I got to meet Schumacher at the 1995 British Grand Prix. And I actually was fortunate enough to play his goodbye message when he left the sport. I can't remember what year it was now, maybe 2012, 2013, something like that. on the way to the grid in Sao Paulo. So that was kind of a weird, very surreal moment, having grown up watching him to be responsible for playing his goodbye message to the sport. So yeah, very poignant.
Oh, I could imagine that, Ray. And like you mentioned as well, it's like it's kind of interesting that it's like full circle, because you mentioned kind of being there in the 90s where Schumacher was becoming more prominent, in his Ferrari and Benetton days, and then being there and almost being there for his last kind of impactful moment in Formula One, where he retired in Brazil. And I remember getting quite emotional about that, being a a fan of the sport, because my dad's a huge Schumacher fan. So I remember listening to that eerie message, and I was like, oh my god, this is like the time when you retired back in 2006. And I was like, oh, maybe there might be one hope that he'll come out of retirement again and maybe try and do it that way. But of course that wasn't meant to be. But no, some really interesting moments that you've highlighted, Ray, and we'll talk about some of those in a bit more detail in a second. Another thing that we like to do on this podcast as well, Ray, is kind of give the younger audience kind of an idea of some of the journeys our guests have been through, whether it's academically or kind of just in terms of work experience that they've been through to kind of get to the stage they are now. For you, Ray, you're a graduate of the University of Greenwich. You studied media and communications as well. At the time, what would you say about like the media sector? Like, was it your dream or your ambition to get into that kind of field of work when you're growing up? And also, how easy was it back then to find work experience? And what were the most important skills you developed in your early years of the TV production that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. Just to give anyone who's listening a little bit of background. So I'm not from a rich family. I'm not from a private school. I'm just an ordinary kid who grew up in Kent, who went to a normal state school. And I remember going to see the careers advisors. I don't know if you guys went through all of that, but at our school, they brought people in and they said, okay, what is it you want to do when you grow up? And I always used to say, I want to work on Match of the Day, the football program in England. And they were like, okay, what about being a plumber though? Or maybe a carpenter? And I was like, well, no, not really. This is what I've always wanted to do. So as ridiculous as it sounded to them and to my friends and family, that was what I always wanted to do. So I and this is obviously pre-internet, pre-email, even pre-fax probably as well. So back in those days, you had to either pick up the telephone and try and get to speak to somebody who you wanted to work for, or you wrote them a handwritten letter, which is what I did to the BBC Sport department. And I was fortunate enough to get some work experience. So I used to go and spend my weekends working on Match of the Day for free. And on Grandstand, I used to sit behind the presenter as one of the many guys in the background. And you just kind of made connections through there, work for free. So I studied all week. I played football on Sundays. But yeah, so I used to go up to London from Kent on my own as a 16, 17, 18-year-old and just work away and make contacts like that. So that's how I first got a foot in the door, essentially.
That's amazing, Ray. And then what I like about your response as well is that, you've given us the context that for a lot of people, we're not here to bash people that have more privileged or more fortunate kind of upbringings and like family situations, because of course everyone has a slightly different, story and upbringing as well. But for you, you're just like us in that sense that, nothing came on like a silver spoon and you had to go and basically engineer your own opportunities and go out there and actually make the sacrifice, which I think will be really inspirational for a lot of our listeners. But on top of that, I'm sure there are times where things didn't go to plan, or perhaps maybe you're expecting to hear back from, maybe one company wrote you and then they didn't like revert back to you. How do you deal with like trying to find continuous motivation and deal with rejection at times as well, when, it's such an area which is so niche, and I feel like you mentioned in schools doesn't really get talked about a lot?
Yeah, so I would say, so as part of the degree course that you mentioned earlier, the media and communication course, which was fantastic, by the way, as part of our second year or third year, maybe, we had to do, as well as our dissertation, we had to do a special project. So going back to that BBC mention that I mentioned earlier, so back at that time, BBC was still making the Formula One coverage. So I thought it would be a very clever idea of me to go wandering around the corridor and knock on the office door of the head of BBC's Formula One coverage and say, how would you feel about me and my two friends on my course making a student documentary on how the BBC produced the 1995 British Grand Prix? And he said, yeah, I think that would be a good idea. We've never done it before, but yeah, we don't mind. So I used that contact that I'd made before, and then we wrote to Bernie Ecclestone, who was the be-all and end-all for Formula One. So we thought we were being really, really clever by me using my contacts, and what great ideas. We'd made all these plans, and we got I think it was a one-sentence fax reply through our college that said basically, no, you won't be doing this documentary. So we were rejected, and all our plans were kind of in tatters. So basically, I badgered for about 3 months non-stop. And in the end, he said, yep, okay, you can do it. Just don't get yourselves killed. So, so eventually we got to do it. So we went up with the BBC, myself and my two colleagues from my two student friends. And we spent a week at Silverstone filming, meeting BBC presenters. We interviewed Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill and Murray Walker. It was fabulous. Really, really good.
That's an incredible kind of story there, Ray. And like you mentioned as well, like, it's really intriguing to kind of hear that, you had this idea already kind of conceived. You then obviously ran it by the university and the BBC team as well, which were on board with it. But I guess if there was ever going to be like a block in the chain that would prevent such an event or idea from happening, it's going to be the chairman of the sport, Benny Ecclestone, that would do that. But, to be able to even still have the perseverance and to kind of like find other ways of making it possible and not giving up straight away, I think it's really inspirational, and a lot could be learned, I think, for our younger audience as well, in terms of even if things don't go right in the first instance, or if you knock on the door and you don't get a yes, it's not the end of the world, and you can still find inspiration and try and kind of find other creative ways of being innovative.
Definitely. I just think if you want something enough, I think eventually you'll find a way. Of course, it may have never ever been a yes, but I think eventually, if you stick at something, you will eventually break through that glass ceiling. So, yeah, we were lucky enough to do it, and it was like a once in a lifetime experience for all of us. So, yeah, it was fantastic. Loved it.
That sounds incredible, Ray. And whilst on the topic of like the TV production side of it as well, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask, Ray, what was the state of the network like at that time? Because you gave us some really cool, like, time period correct, insight into just how fast technology and just TV networks were moving at the time, in terms of like faxing or even being able to have like a set and the way that, like picture, entertainment, sports was being captured and broadcasted to fans. We also know from our due diligence that, you did some time with ITV and Granada Sports at the time too. What would you say has changed in terms of the landscape of the TV network between now and then? And what would you say was the most enjoyable time of those early years?
So I would say, so basically, first and foremost, I'm a sports fan. Always have been, always will be. I'm just obsessed with it. It's the first thing I look at on my phone when I wake up in the morning. So growing up in that era was a frustrating time, I would say. So I would say I'm first and foremost a football fan. That was my first love of sport. But I love football. I love Formula One. I love golf. I love cricket, tennis, snooker, darts. You name it, I watch it, or used to. So growing up in the time in my own experience at least, was the time where you'd have to sort of lay under your duvet with a transistor radio, listening to sport. You had to wait for 3 matches in the old First Division, what's now the Premier League, to get a league table. There was no 24-hour news station, sports news stations. There just wasn't the access back then that we have now. And it seems weird to even think about it now. But now, if you want anything in sports, you can access it on the TV, on your computer, on your telephone. You can watch it, you can listen to it, you can talk about it on social media. whatever you want, it's there at your fingertips. Back then, you almost had to be tenacious to find out or to experience by viewing or going to the grounds or listening to the radio, watching on TV. You had to hunt it out and you had to be patient. Now everything's available at your fingertips. And I'll be honest, I much prefer these days where everything is so accessible. I think it's fantastic. So I would say that's the biggest change that I can sort of recall, but it's been a long time now, obviously.
Absolutely there, Ray. And I kind of share my early memories as well on the, to piggyback on that thought as well, because growing up I was born in 95 and then was like watching Formula One from when I was like 4 or 5 with my dad, in the sitting room. And I remember just him having teletext and then having to kind of use that to get the results or the live standings, which is like a real throwback. And even the TV production of F1 at a certain stage when it was on ITV and having kind of like the blue background with yellow writing and the likes of like Jim Rosenthal doing the hosting as well was really kind of like a time to think about. And like you mentioned, getting access about information or the latest developments in news with the teams, it was so much more harder to kind of get. And in a way, I feel like at least now, lots of people these days will say, well, the casual drive to survive fan has easy access through, means of like, the internet or through, social media. Whereas before it was a lot more harder. I still kind of agree with you that the way it's shaped and the way the landscape's developed, it's for the better. And ultimately as well, I think it's made it become more accessible for the fans to become part of the sport, and also in a way as well as given the fans that kind of perspective to be, almost like a fly on the wall as such in terms of really getting the insight into the experience. So that's super key, and I think like you mentioned as well, it's interesting to see that change in the industry, in terms of the digital production and the plethora of all the tools we have now.
Yeah, it is. And funny enough, when you mentioned Jim Rosenthal there, in my first job after graduating, that I used to travel to Southampton back every day. So from my house in East Sussex, it's 100 miles there and 100 miles back. And one of the programs we used to make down there was the ITV Formula One highlights of each race. So, and Jim Rosenthal used to present the show, and Ted Kravitz was the pit lane reporter. Or one of the two, I think, with Louise Goodman. But Jim, we used to say to him, like, okay, Jim, we need an opening script for this, 38 seconds, please. And even, honestly, without a script, 38 seconds, bang, every time, perfect. It was just unbelievable to witness someone so professional. He was excellent.
Oh, that's incredible. And I can imagine it as well, because even just sitting at home, my dad used to say the same thing about, Jim Rosenthal too. And this his ability, to kind of give you the screenshot of what was going on in the sport and just the way he would lay down the foundations of setting the scene for that race weekend and the championship scenario and just what happened with the drivers as well. So it's interesting to kind of draw that parallel between your experiences directly with Jim and then us as the kind of fans and consumer as well of the sport too. So that's really interesting. And then to bring it on to the next subject here, Ray, let's talk more about your role. So, you've briefly kind of told us like that you work with the Formula One management group. You've been there now for 12 years, which is amazing, because it feels like in Formula One, no one's really there long. So if you're there for 12 years, it means you're doing a really great job, must I add. But yeah, tell our audience more about your role within kind of what you do with the sport and the TV production side of it. How did the opportunity come about from what you were doing before? And actually, what does a race weekend look like in terms of your duties and arriving at the track, assuming that, you're one of the traveling members of the crew?
Yep. Okay. So lots of things to answer, and you're going to have to nudge me on a lot of those because I'm going to forget those. But okay, let me firstly start by saying, since COVID, we remote produce the production now at Biggin Hill at the MNCC in Kent. So we travelled for a long time, and there's plenty of people who've worked for Formula One for a lot longer than me. So just to be clear, so I'm not a full-time employee. I'm a freelancer. But yeah, so 12 years now. So let's go back a bit. So how did I start there? Okay, so about the documentary that we made at the 1995 British Grand Prix, and I went there with two student friends. So one of those guys is now the director of the broadcast of the International World Feed and has worked there for 20 something years now. So we were best friends at university. Spent every day together, studying together, playing snooker after every day of lectures together. And then we didn't see each other for about 15 years. Both left the town we grew up in. I don't do social media. And he thought I went into a black hole, disappeared into a cave by not being on Facebook or Twitter. And we bumped into each other one day, 12 years ago. And I said, "Oh, brilliant. How are you, mate? What are you up to?" And he said, "Oh, I work for Formula One." And he was always the Formula One nut, not me. I was always the football nut. But I loved Formula One, but not as much as him and nowhere near as technical as him. So he said, "Come and meet my boss. Come and have a chat." And he was like, "Well, asking what I'd done and etc." So I went and had a chat with the boss, and I've basically been there ever since. So yes, I got into Formula One doing the job I'm doing through my connection, through my university friend. But basically, that only gets you so far. It gets you in the building, but it doesn't keep you in the building. So you've got to keep yourself in the building. So that's how I joined Formula One, which is a bit of a weird sort of full circle from our student days. So the job I do, I'm the team radio producer, one of a team. Team radio is just one small team in a much, much bigger production. And we all have our input, obviously, to the TV side. So my job is to decide every single clip that any viewer hears on the International World Feed. So it doesn't matter which country you're in, you'll be listening to the clips that I find interesting. So essentially, that's the job that I actually fulfill for Formula One.
That is interesting. And, even just mentioning how you got into it with your friend as well, which is interesting because I feel like everyone has a story similar to that where like they've gone through university or education with someone and then they end up kind of meeting full circle, like you mentioned, kind of at the end of like, the studying part of it and getting into the actual world of work as well, which is super cool. And then in terms of your role as well, Ray, that is one responsibility because, like I'm sure you appreciate yourself, Ray, but sometimes just even on Twitter, those clips that end up going up with something a driver said or, communication between a race engineer and let's say the FIA can be what will be a huge thing on Twitter, whether it's a meme, whether it's like a very philosophical debate, let's say, in terms of the F1 fandom on Twitter. It's really huge in terms of how it affects the way we perceive the sport, how we look at certain incidents maybe that play out within a race, and of course as well just our perception of the drivers and teams too. But you mentioned there, Ray, as well that like a lot of the clips we hear are kind of moments that you find interesting. How do you decipher that, and how do you take the kind of stuff that's really pertinent and the stuff that is going to grab the attention of the listeners or be something of interest to fans with this kind of the regular stuff that the drivers probably say to the engineers all the time?
I don't even know really. I just do it. I just know it when I've heard it. I would so in terms of where my sort of everyone's got their own their own opinions on what's good and what's bad. So as some people could be watching a race for the very first time, and someone could have been watching for the last 50 years and know everything about how to disassemble a Formula One car and put it back together. I would say I'm somewhere in the middle. So I'm not technical. I'm no expert. I'm not an Adrian Newey. Equally, it's not my first race either, so I do understand what things mean when I'm, so I know what a pit stop is. I know what a flag colour means, etc., etc. So you've got to remember that you're catering to the mass audience and not exclude anybody. You want everyone to enjoy what you're playing. But I think fundamentally, if you forget the words team and radio, essentially we're storytellers. We're there to tell a story. So I try to make sure that every time that team radio graphic pops up on your television screen, I really want people to go, oh, hang on, let's listen to this. Stop talking, everyone. I want to hear what this driver or this engineer or this team principal is going to say. So I like to think we've got there, and everyone's got their own opinion. Anyone who does my job would have a different selection that I have, but I don't know. I mean, you're trying to entertain, you're trying to inform. So whether that's, if there was no team radio, you'd be watching cars going around in circles. Now, let's take the race that's just gone. So Singapore, the whole weekend, if you bear in mind Red Bull's dominance so far this season, if you were watching that without team radio from Friday to Sunday, you might be thinking, okay, so Max and Checo are having an off weekend. Well, they weren't, because they're elite athletes and elite drivers. There was a reason behind, the reason they're not dominating this particular weekend, and they can tell that story themselves. So whether that's to do with the front or rear end, or the upshifts and downshifts that Max was complaining about, or Checo with the rear end stepping out, or the brakes, we can educate and inform, but also entertain at the same time. So everyone seems to really enjoy a Max and GP row or discussion, I should say. But so without team radio, the viewers wouldn't have a clue what's gone on then until the drivers have got out of the cars, gone to the media pen and done their interviews. So, it's a combination of all those things.
Absolutely there, Ray. And what I'd like to kind of pick up on there, what you said as well, is that I think even with the drivers being able to go to the paddock and kind of give their accounts of, either questions they're being asked or just generally their experiences on track, there's nothing quite as raw or almost as intimate or almost as real as what comes out of their head first thing as soon as they touch that radio button on the steering wheel. And that's getting transmitted, obviously, from themselves to the team as well. And also, like you mentioned too, it's really key. Like, I hope people look at this and actually think about how integral it is to painting a picture and understanding further some of the challenges and tricks that go through in Formula One. Because, of course, like you mentioned, Red Bull have been really impressive this season. They've continued to, assert the dominance in the sport. We're almost looking at them to make it 11 on the bounce, which I think in any sport is practically unheard of, and then they come to Singapore. They've got a car which, for some reason, is not in its optimal kind of window. You've got two different drivers with two different styles, like Checo, which, hasn't had the best of seasons, but has been doing some really good recovery drives, saying that the car is not in a zone where he feels comfortable enough to drive it. And the rear end was stepping out because of the brake balance not being quite there. Or Max kind of saying, these upshifts are really annoying me and I'm not able to progressively get onto the accelerator as quickly as possible because of this kind of issue that we're having with the gearbox and the way it's synchronized with the power unit. It's interesting, and it's something which, without the input, of the radio production team and the work that you guys do, it isn't as transparent to us. Because to be fair, I think ever since Bahrain, Max, even though he was leading by at least 20 or 30 seconds, was talking about the differential and the upshifts. And throughout, I think even Australia, if we remember correctly as well in practice, Checo was mentioning something about the brake bias, even in a practice session back then. So without the radio messages, sometimes these recurring themes or patterns that we see in the sport, they don't become so obvious to us, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I just to make clear, I have almost no understanding what half of it means, but I know it's important, and I'm basically parroting exactly what they said. So, obviously downshifts, upshifts, that's gears, etc. But so, yeah, our job is really to try and just inform viewers exactly what the problem is, if there is a problem, or that emotion, as you said, yes, when drivers press the team radio button to talk to their team, yes, it's not polished and it's not gone via a public relations company. It's them talking. But equally, I would say, so whilst, yes, there's a raw honesty to it, I think also the speeds that these guys are doing, it's ridiculously fast. And if somebody recorded me driving I would say that occasionally a reaction that might come out of my mouth wouldn't reflect the true me. But when you're, if someone pulls out in front of you on a motorway, then you react, don't you? Because your adrenaline levels are flowing. And I think people should also bear in mind that, that's probably not the real, the polished version's not the real them. And I would say probably the team radio version, when they're at heightened state of awareness, is probably not the real them either. It's probably somewhere bang in the middle.
Of course, and I agree with you as well, Ray. When we look at these drivers, they're almost like gladiators in terms of their kind of mindset to risk that they have, but also just the adrenaline is running through them as well as they're taking some of these corners. And I'll kind of not digress, but go on a really funny anecdote I saw the other day. Christian Horner was on this podcast and he was talking about his early days, because many people forget that at one stage before we knew Christian Horner, the team principal at Red Bull, he himself was like a junior F2, F3 driver looking to go up the ranks. And he was talking about coming out of the pits one day in a practice session at Portugal, and there being this really high speed blind corner, which, you couldn't really see the apex of further than. And Juan Pablo Montoya just gone around this corner completely flat, completely committed. And it was like nothing to him. It's like putting water on a duck's back. Whereas for Christian, he couldn't accept it in his mind to kind of disconnect the risk of driving so quickly with the risk of obviously having a crash. And that in itself, I think, puts into perspective just how quick things happen in a Formula One car. And it's the only sport I feel in that sense where to capture what the driver's saying and the essence of things that are moving at 200 miles an hour is one of the most challenging, but I think also one of the most rewarding things in terms of the product that we're given as well.
100%. And I think, when people see that a driver's last in the classification, and they last, say, by 2 seconds, that they are, every one of those guys out there, and everyone who's ever driven a Formula One car, they are proper heroes. They are proper elite drivers, and not to be dismissed lightly. I think, full respect to those guys.
Absolutely, Ray. And talking about kind of the image and perception of them that we have, with the being heroes and gladiators, and just kind of the impact that F1 athletes have had just on the wider world. For FOM, for the Formula One Management Group, how big is the emphasis on adding insight into the audience's experience and kind of giving them that immersion between the driver and obviously broadcasting that on TV?
So do you mean from a team radio perspective or a general perspective?
Both would be interesting to get kind of your response on.
Yeah, so I mean, to be honest, I mean, my focus is purely team radio. Yes, we had general meetings about the upcoming event that day, etc. But so my focus, I can only really speak for team radio because that's all I've really experienced. But
sure.
I don't know. The honest answer is I don't know. I know that I'm, that myself and my team, I would say anyone can make a plan. This is what we want to do. This is how we're going to do it. But before, when those green lights go out, when the lights go green at pit exit for practice 1, 2, 3, and for quali, and the lights go out for the race, honestly, you're literally, anything can happen at any point. And I think it's all about being flexible and reactive, and the drivers and the cars tell the story. We basically what happens, we are just following them. Basically, we can say, right, okay, we want to show this shot. We'd like to hear a driver say this. We'd like to hear that driver say that. You can't put words in anyone's mouth, so you've got to just tell the truth and basically reflect exactly what is happening on track or in the pit lane or on the pit wall. So yeah, I mean, it is, and it's so fast. Honestly, you really can't strategize too much. So to give you an idea of what we go through in our little room, because again, as I said, that's all I can speak for. Mm-hmm. So if you stood and I threw 20 tennis balls at you, and let's say you caught 2 or managed to get 3, and you're looking at those tennis balls thinking, am I going to broadcast those? And while you're looking at those 2 or 3 tennis balls, another 20 have come at you, and then another 20, and then another 20. And that's what it's like trying to listen to team radio, especially during qualifying or a race day. It is relentlessly quick, and it never stops. And it is such a challenge and such an adrenaline rush. But everyone in our team is honestly absolutely loves it, and we're addicted to it. But it's so, unless you've heard it in your ears, it's just unbelievably quick. I think over the course of a weekend, someone calculated there were 50,000 separate individual team radio messages spoken.
Wow.
So 50,000 in, what have we got, 5 sessions. It's a lot, and I don't know, I have no idea how many we broadcast, and it obviously always changes, but you're talking like a tiny percentage of what we hear gets broadcast. But it feels like we never stop, because you're constantly listening to voices and decide, yes, we want that clip, no, we don't want that, yeah, okay, we want this one. It's transcribed. You know, when you see the clips written down as well now, the radio clip.
Mm-hmm.
So we decide that. So we've got a guy who literally physically types it next to me, and I have to try and spell check it on screen whilst listening to 20 drivers and then calling it in and playing it on the broadcast. It's unbelievable. We love it, honestly. I'm not trying to talk it up, but it's fantastic.
It sounds exciting, Ray. You know, it must be like a rush, you know, to say the least, because it's having the ability, I guess, as well, to kind of, you know, multitask and to deal with the bits that are pertinent, but then also kind of keeping out an ear for other kind of emerging stories or you know, messages from other kind of drivers in the kind of list as well, and doing the other kind of administrative parts as well, like transcribing it and getting it out to the viewers as well. Like, it doesn't sound like an easy feat at all, but I could see why it'd be so exciting and why no 2 days would ever be exactly the same, because just like in Formula One, even though the outcome might be the same, or, you know, like you might get used to seeing one particular driver win, the way that they get that race win from start to finish always have slightly different turning points and different considerations and different things that arise as and when they do. So that's really interesting, and I think, you know, insightful for our listeners to hear as well, Ray. And on the topic of it, I know with this question we had to kind of edit it a bit and redact it because some of it was kind of out of what you do. But just generally speaking, you know, what are the things that we don't hear on the radio broadcast? So kind of get like, you know, left. Is there like strict rules on a general point of view as to what can and can't be published on the network?
Not really. No. So, as I said, I choose the clips. Occasionally, something might come up that I think that's, you know, that would be in poor taste. Like, you know, so if something happens on track and someone's injured, or you hear the sound of someone who may be injured, you wouldn't play. Well, excuse me. I wouldn't play that, because they've got family and loved ones who are watching them, and that would be, I think, appalling. And I don't think anyone wants to see that or listen to that. But no, generally I'm left to make my own decisions. I would say a lot of what you don't hear, and a lot of those 50,000 messages, a lot of it is drivers being told the gaps to the car behind and the gap to the car in front, because they don't want to penalise, you know, especially in qualifying. You know, what you're being told, okay, so if you're Max Verstappen, you're being told, okay, Lewis is 5 seconds, 4 seconds, 3 seconds. Lewis on a fast lap, 2 seconds, 1 second, and then obviously Max has to get out of Lewis's way. And then there's another driver. So if you're on a charge lap and you're slow, you've got to make sure you don't impede other drivers. So a lot of the communication from the race engineers is about traffic coming from behind and not impeding their rivals, basically.
Fair enough there, Ray. And yeah, you know, it's like it's interesting you mentioned as well, like, you know, those kind of moments which, you know, they're kind of more sad or kind of moments where they're concerning, but also I think they can be quite powerful too, because I think, like, let's go back example to Silverstone last year, where Zhou Guanyu had that really horrific accident kind of going into turn one. And, you know, all of us kind of as TV listeners or watchers were waiting just to kind of hear on the radio whether he was okay. And then finally we got that radio transmission of him saying that he's fine and that, you know, he's about to jump out of the car. I think, you know, the difference between those and kind of the ones which aren't so like great in taste are really important and kind of give us also perspective of how dangerous the sport can be as well. So it's great, and I think it's also cool that there's not too many restrictions on what you can put out, but also what is put out is respectful enough and courteous enough, like you mentioned, to the drivers and their families, of course, as well, that are fans of the sport just like us.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. My phone cut out and I missed almost all of that. I'm really sorry.
No worries there, Ray. I was just like, I was just talking about like how it's good that, you know, you guys have like the creative freedom to kind of like put out the things that you think are meaningful, but at the same time as well, you guys are almost like your own moderators in terms of like, you know, not putting stuff out that's gonna be, you know, not nice for a particular situation, and giving like an example of, for example, Zhou Guan Yu when he had that incident last year
Yeah.
at Silverstone. All of us just as TV watchers were really hoping that, you know, he was okay. And then when we got that transmission, you know, on the radio that he was fine and that he hopped out of the car and that, you know, everything had been switched off and the marshals were attending to him. I think those moments like that as well put into perspective for fans like us, just how dangerous the sport is, and it's almost just like surreal being kind of in the helmet and kind of hearing what their thoughts are at the time as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say also remember that all myself, my colleagues, everyone who works on these productions, we are like you guys. We are all Formula One fans. We're all sports fans. So if you react to shock and awe, then basically we are doing exactly the same. But we are obviously we have to spring into action to tell the story. So going back to last weekend in Singapore, when Lance Stroll crashed right at the on his last flying lap, I think it was at turn 19. Very fast crash. And his engineer came through and asked him, you know, are you okay? And he clearly was okay. So, you know, it's always a relief and a pleasure to be able to clip that up very quickly and broadcast to the viewers that actually, yeah, the driver's okay. The car was, but Lance was well in himself, at least. I know he obviously subsequently missed the race, but, you know, no major harm done from all accounts, and thank goodness as well. So, so yeah, it's nice when you get the opportunity to do that, because as them, and you know, if that was my family, I'd like to think someone would play my clip very quickly as well to let everyone know that they're okay.
Absolutely, there, Ray. I 110% agree with you on that. And you know, it's so key because again, kind of going back to how it was back in the olden days, like for example, you know, and it was really sad as well. I actually wasn't even born at that time, but like listening to accounts of it, when Senna unfortunately lost his life, just I could only imagine how the news was broadcasted back then, and you know, the teams and maybe the drivers and the staff at the circuit would have known, but then all the fans around the world probably wouldn't have had any clue as to what Senna's condition was at the time. And I think Murray Walker did an interview one time with Sky, and he's saying that it was hard to kind of transmit that to the fans because even with him, he didn't know whether to say, you know, that he was going to be okay, because then if Senna wasn't okay, that would be a lie to the fans. But then also, he knew that he couldn't be insensitive enough to say that a driver just died at a circuit, because that also wouldn't be correct. So it's amazing that at least now we kind of have the tools and you guys working diligently behind the scenes to kind of give us access, but at the same time, the boundaries are kind of respected for the drivers, and they're almost given that kind of like space too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, with regard to Ayrton Senna and that tragic day, you know, I was one of the millions watching on my TV as well. So, and it was awful, absolutely awful, heartbreaking. So yeah, so in terms of advancements and the introduction of team radio, it's you know, there are lots of positives to come out of it, and that's just one of many.
Absolutely there, Ray. Well, you know, on the topic of positives, like we're gonna get some fan questions in as well before we go. But Ray, let's start off with what would you say is the funniest driver radio message you've heard? One of our fans wanted to know, and also they've kind of put their own nominations in there if there was any that you hadn't thought of before. So we've got King
Go on,
Raikkonen.
tell me what they put first before I tell you mine. Because
Sure.
honestly, it's hard to pick one out. So I've probably forgotten loads that we played. Go on, read those to me.
Sure. So we've got Kimi Räikkönen's infamous "Leave me alone, I know what I'm doing," which went down
Yep.
quite well in Abu Dhabi a couple of years ago. We've got Pablo Montoya's "Oh dear," and context of this was I think
Yeah.
a deer had run
There
onto the
was a deer on
circuit,
the track.
and the team were trying to tell him, like, there's a deer there, and Pablo decided to get quite witty and use a double entendre in terms of saying "oh dear," so
Yeah,
it's
I've
quite
seen it on YouTube. Yeah.
so there was that. And even in more recent history, we were talking about Singapore being the most recent Grand Prix we've been to. A couple of years ago, Max Verstappen was driving around the streets of Singapore, and there was a huge lizard, to which Max said something to the effect of, "There's a giant lizard on the track." Only then, this week, Max to be driving around, and then, there was like a poor little cute lizard that was walking on the floor and flicking out his tongue, and him and GP were having a whole 2-minute conversation, like on his outlap, about how this mini lizard could be the son of like the favored lizard from a couple of years ago, and probably the
That's
son of
right.
Godzilla.
Yeah, I think we had 3 yellow flags on Friday. Yeah, all for lizards, if that's the official name. Yeah, crossing track. Yeah, GP said I think maybe Godzilla's had a kid. I think we played. Yeah. So I can't take any credit for the Juan Pablo Montoya one. That was before I joined. The Kimi Räikkönen one was my first season. That was in 2012 in Abu Dhabi. And I very nearly didn't play that one because it was a really crackly transmission. I mean, these days it's great because we've got the ability to write it as well as broadcast it, as well as playing the clip. So yeah, we're doing fine, no problem at all. But yeah, I do remember that one. I thought that I'm sure I played a subsequent one in the same race. So it was Simon Rennie, who ended up being Daniel Ricciardo's engineer, I think, was Kimi's engineer at the time. And then Kimi said to him a few minutes later, or later on in the race, he said, yeah, I'm doing it all the time. You don't have to keep reminding me every 10 seconds or something to that effect. I think it's warming all 4 tires or something like that. I remember the first time we played Lewis with okay, Lewis, it's hammer time from Bono. I remember the editor sat next to me at the time. He said, "We're not playing that, are we?" I was like, "Yes, we're playing that," and it just became a thing. It just sort of, it's weird the way the thing catches up. So Max and his Simply Lovely carries on. We've had loads of stuff. I think Jenson Button was asked maybe 2013 how are the tyres, and he said, "Yeah, black and round, same as usual," or something like that. But you get the odd fun. Lando's quite funny. Carlos Sainz is quite sort of dry and witty in his comments. I think was it Jenson stood in for Fernando. I can't remember what year, in Monaco, maybe 2018.
Was this the one where you threatened to pee in his car?
Yeah, he said, "I'm going to pee in your seat" or something like that. That was quite good. But yeah, I just forget half of them. I mean, not even the funny one. I mean, Danny Rick was always, really good entertainment as well. And, sometimes you got to lick the stamp and send it. I mean, I'd never even thought of that. Honestly, I thought that was really good. What else? Gasly over the line, celebrating in Monza. And was it Sao Paulo as well? But yeah, I just, when he goes mad, he properly goes mad, with excitement. But there's so many. And I'm sure I'm forgetting loads of them, but yeah, Vettel was very good as well, actually, really good.
Oh well, Vettel's given us so many ones. I'm like even thinking of I think there's that one lap he got pole at I think it was Mexico. It must have been 2019 or something to that effect. And I think he was at pole position.
Yeah. I'm not now you've said that, I'm not sure I worked that race, or maybe I was doing a different role that race, because I don't think I played that one. But yeah, I know what you mean. And all the what are we doing here? Racing all ping pong. And all that sort of stuff. It is good. Honestly, if I sat and thought about it for hours, there's loads that make us laugh. But again, when we hear it, we're the same as you guys when you're hearing it on your TVs. We are cracking up laughing sometimes when we hear some of the stuff they come out with. And obviously some of it you can't play, but most of it is just so funny and really, really good.
Absolutely, I could imagine there, Ray. And kind of like to flip the coin on its head, some of our viewers have also asked us to ask you, like, what's the most awkward driver radio message you've heard? Like something along the lines of like maybe an engineer giving their driver a bollocking, or maybe a team miscommunication with like maybe some drive like team orders or a miscommunication. What would you say is like the most awkward one that you've had or heard over the years?
Oh my goodness. I really should have done some sitting down thinking about this. The most awkward. Yeah, team orders is a tricky one. But I think, you know, from our, and this is not a cop out of the answer, but I think if we tell the truth, then, you know, you can't pretend someone's doing an overtake when it's a team order, and I think you need to just tell the truth, and I think we do that very well. Some awkward ones. I don't actually a sort of a funny and awkward one we did maybe 2021 in America when we were doing the FIA team radio. I think Alan Permain on the Alpine pit wall was complaining about Kimi Räikkönen overtaking someone off track, and he said something along the lines of, "So we can overtake off track now, can we?" He said, "No." Michael Massey said, "No." He said, "But it's okay for Räikkönen." He said, "No, it's not okay for anyone." But he goes, "But it is okay for Räikkönen," or something like that. And he just wouldn't let it go. And it was awkward, but it made me laugh anyway. But yeah, so I'm just trying to think some others. But yeah, I mean, as I said, GP Max's engineer is very good. I can remember he was, I think he was Paul di Resta's engineer at Force India several years ago. And I think that di Resta had been knocked out early in qualifying. And I don't know if we broadcast it, but I can remember him saying, "Don't shake your head at me, Paul," or something like that. And I thought, oh, that was a bit tasty. But yeah, so he's clearly not a shrinking violet. So, and, you know, obviously him and Max have an entertaining relationship on the team radio as well. So it's great.
I can imagine. And yeah, like, you know, with Paul and kind of like GP as well, like it's interesting to see even like the dynamics of how they would interact with each other, and even now how like Max interacts with, you know, GP too. Because even the other day, I think at Spa, Max was preparing for outlap, but it was one of those situations where we had like a damp to drying circuit, and whoever was going to set the fastest lap was likely to do it by crossing the line last for the track evolution. So
yeah,
GP was trying to coach Max to kind of get to the start line as late as possible to get the ultimate conditions. And it almost cost him, I think, the opportunity to progress into Q3. And Max is completely losing it, although at this point he'd already made it through. And GP just comes on the radio and says, "Well, all right, mate. Well, next time you do your own strategy then and see how you do." it's
really I
remember.
Yeah. Yeah, that was Belgium, wasn't it? Yeah, you're right. That was, yeah, only a few races ago. Yeah, they do fly by, honestly. It's ridiculously quick.
Oh, I could imagine, man. Like, again, like it must never get old in that sense too. Just kind of hearing the interactions and seeing kind of how the drivers talk to, you know, the engineers that either they worked with for a long time, like, you know, Lewis and Bono, or maybe some of the new kind of pairings. Because I think this year Russell's got a completely new race engineer with Bradley being alongside him. So yeah, it's really
I think it's Marcus Dudley, actually.
There we go.
Before he stepped in for Bono when he was ill a couple of years ago, or not ill, but missed the race or whatever the reason was. But yeah, so yeah, they seem to work well. Him and George, actually, they're very good partnership.
Absolutely. You know, and just kind of before we bring this episode to a close, Ray, and again, thank you for your time, because it's been really insightful and kind of funny as well to reflect on some of these moments too. But, you know, more of a question to just you generally. What are the plans for the future? Is there any like projects? I know that you mentioned earlier you do some like a lot of like freelancing kind of work as well. And another kind of question that's come through from our fans is, if you were a racing driver, what motivational radio message would you give to people that you are going to inspire along your career path?
Okay, so first question first. Future plans and projects. No, I said I don't know how many races I've been the team radio producer for, but probably 200 and something. But every time I walk in the building and sit down in the chair, I get butterflies. I get nervous. I do believe I'm the best person for the job, but you've got to, there's no hiding place when you sit down to do it. So you never feel comfortable. And every time you get booked to do another race, it's like a win, in my mind at least. And I think the whole of our team feel the same. So, being booked for the next season is success in itself, because it's not an easy job. In terms of advice, or a message from, if I was a driver, what would I want to hear from an engineer? I think Lewis was quite good, actually, when was it 2020 when he said something along the lines of, that's for all the kids out there, that you can do it as two-man, or something along those lines, when he was driving back in on the cool down lap. I think something like that is actually maybe not massively relevant, but kind of, to me,
Mm-hmm.
as again, yes, everyone has different backgrounds and chances and upbringing. But yeah, I mean, literally, you can do it too. Anyone, if you put your mind to something, no one, well, maybe they do now, but I did not grow up thinking I want to be the team radio producer when I leave school, because I don't think team radio existed. In fact, I know it didn't exist back then. But I always wanted to work in live sport. It's what I love. And I loved it before I did it. So I think if you find something that's genuinely a passion and you are lucky enough to do it for a job, it is quite an amazing feeling. And if that's what any boys, girls, men or women listening to this want to do when they grow up or get older, don't let anything stop you. Yeah, you'll get told no loads and loads of times, but if you want it enough, eventually someone will break and you will get through and get your chance. And if you're good enough, you'll stay there as well. So that would be what I would say.
Thank you for that, Ray. That's really inspirational. I think, like you mentioned, it's key. There's so many times where life kind of kicks us down, or things might not go the way we expect them to, but it's finding the perseverance, finding the kind of hunger and passion and the desire to go after a goal. And I think it makes it even more rewarding and even more kind of this amazing when you find a job that doesn't feel like a job, because it's a passion that you really endear and love, and you're able to do it in such a way that the passion and approach you take to it rubs off on other people as well in a really positive light too there, Ray. So thank you for that. It's amazing to kind of hear that. Before you go as well, we're talking about future plans and projects. I know that you're just kind of mainly excited just for your work that you do with the radio production team and so forth. But thoughts, what are your thoughts also on just radio messages or live sports being broadcasted from the athlete's perspective in other sports? Because over the years, recently, we started to see referees in football get mic'd up. I think even at the weekend, I think it was Yuri Tillerman that now plays for Aston Villa was wearing a microphone as well, and you can hear him saying "man on" and making these calls as the game was being played. With Formula One probably being one of the first sports to capture that, and now that idea being transcended into other sports. What's your take on that? And do you think it's as good as it has been in Formula One to kind of see just that extra dimension of perspective given to the fans?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously television sport has evolved massively over the years. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of it. Obviously, it's basically, from my perspective, it's like being paid to be an eavesdropper, which everyone loves hearing stuff they shouldn't hear. I know that there's been experiments with cricket in one-day games or limited over matches. They will put a microphone on a particular player. In terms of football, I think the contact nature of it would make it quite difficult in terms of, I mean, I'm no engineer, so I don't understand all the technology behind it, but an easy win for me. But I would, as a sports fan, as a football fan, I would love to hear what the football managers are saying to their team. Not everything, just an occasional quote. I believe that the Tour de France introduced their own version of team radio to their coverage this year. Yeah, I think it's out there, and I think it's slowly going that way. I believe that golf may even have experimented with miking up golfers in a particular tournament. I don't know if that's absolutely true or not, but I'm sure I've heard that. So yeah, I think anything that brings the fan closer to the athletes and the stars that they're watching is all good, basically. I think it adds to the experience for the fans. So yeah, I think it's definitely a positive.
I would 100% agree with your sentiments there, Ray, and I agree as well in terms of bridging the gap between the fans and the sport as well, and kind of giving us that raw kind of experience and insight as well. So, it's been great to kind of hear that from you and to learn so much more about the production side of it too. And a final question, Ray, before we let you go, and this one's from the boss lady Georgina herself. It's the biggest question we ask all the big guests, so you're being added to this list, by the way. Pineapple on pizza, yay or nay?
Right, okay. Before I answer that, no, go on, I'll answer it. Yay. I had it.
Oh, no, Ray, no, Ray, no, don't do that.
Well.
Ray, I love you.
Ray, no, don't do that.
I can remember being a teenager and ringing up a takeaway order for tuna and banana on a pizza, and it was absolutely delicious. Try it. It's unreal. It's so good. Not sure I've had it for about 30 years, but back then it was awesome. Can I say, I can't believe you've asked me to appear on this. I've never done a podcast in my life. No one knows who I am, working in the background along with the rest as well. So thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. But I know you have some big name guests there, and I'm still slightly puzzled as to why I've been asked to do it. But it's been awesome. Thank you very much. It's been great.
Oh, thank you so much, Ray. And well, listen, like for us, just as part of the team, it's about capturing motorsports from all perspectives. And whilst it's cool to get the A-list drivers and team principals and stuff like that, it's also about the people like you who help bring us the sport, and help generate the experience. And it means so much to us just in terms of how the input you have basically creates that experience for us and all the memories that we go on to talk about. And even when we're talking about funny radio messages or memorable radio messages and things like that, I feel people look at, and it's always interesting to get the kind of extra insight and to get those stories, right? So I wouldn't beat down your drum too hard. You're just as important to us as the rest of them. And yeah, I'm sure you'll have more people on LinkedIn, checking you out, which is also key. So guys, if you enjoy this video and this video, this is the audio recording. If you enjoyed this content, please make sure that you interact, that you drop your comments. What did you find fascinating? What did you learn that you didn't know before? What would you want to know maybe in the future? And of course, if you're looking to kind of get into the world of TV production and broadcasting, Ray's a great person. I'm sure if you do it respectfully, he wouldn't mind answering some questions. So we'll have Ray's LinkedIn connected with this post as well when it comes out. But just Ray, a huge thank you to you for your time. It's been amazing. At some point, we'll have to get you back on as well, so we can have some other discussions and talk about maybe some other funny radio messages or memorable moments in sports.
Yeah, I'd love to. It's been great fun. Thank you very much indeed, and I'm glad people are enjoying what we're doing as well. So that's awesome.
They're always enjoying it, Ray. Trust me. It literally, it's the foundation of a lot of the stuff we see and interact with on Twitter. So you guys are doing an amazing job, and we continue to support and wish you all the best with that as well. So yeah, guys, it's been your boy AMG Denz, aka the original smooth operator, not that guy Carlos Sainz that is winning races now and got his funny little radio transparencies there. But either way, a huge shout out to Ray for joining us on this episode and for Georgie for organizing it all. And until next time, it's been your boy AMG Denz, and I'm out. Peace.